Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to take you to July 18th, 1861, the third month of the Civil War. On this day, at a place called Blackburn's Ford, Virginia, a large-scale reconnaissance by about 3,000 U.S. troops ended in failure for the Federals when they encountered about 5,100 Confederates and withdrew after skirmishing that left 83 U.S. and 68 Confederate casualties. 3 days later came the much larger and first major battle of the war, Manassas or Bull Run, another U.S. defeat that sent shockwaves through the North and joy throughout the South. News of the action at Blackburn's Ford spread to the Boston, Massachusetts suburb of Chelsea. There, the mayor of Chelsea learned that among the wounded and dead at Blackburn's Ford were citizens from his town. He's pictured here. Franklin Brigham Frank Fay was in his first term as mayor. He boarded the next train bound for Washington, D.C. to find his local boys in the hospitals. Fay was a philanthropist at heart. His experiences in Washington motivated him to become involved in charity work to support the war effort. The same spirit that drove Mayor Fay inspired the governess of his three children, Helen Gilson, she's pictured here, to get directly involved in the war effort. Described as a slight woman with a resonant voice, Helen applied to become a nurse to Dorothy Dix, the head of Army nurses in Washington. Helen heard nothing at first. Time passed. In April 1862, Helen received an urgent request from Dorothea Dix to report to Washington for duty. According to Mayor Fay, quote, Miss Dix was surprised to find her so young and attractive, and to her eyes, so unfitted for service, end quote. Dix dismissed Helen as a serious candidate for nurse and sent her off to a Washington hospital in an unofficial capacity with no serious duties. Helen did not like this, and she didn't remain in administrative limbo for long. Later that spring, Mayor Fay made his way back to Washington and found the Army of the Potomac then engaged in the Peninsula Campaign. At Fortress Monroe, he crossed paths with Reverend Frederick N. Knapp, a prominent player in the powerful U.S. Sanitary Commission. Knapp was headed with a boatload of supplies and nurses for the front. The two men had a conversation. Mayor Fay discovered that Knapp needed women recruits and recommended Helen. Knapp recalled meeting her in Washington while she was in that limbo and asked Mayor Fay to send her down to Virginia. Fay reached out to Helen. In Washington, she jumped at the chance. She headed south without Mayor Fay, who had returned to Chelsea to get supplies and return to the Army of the Potomac in Virginia. Helen soon arrived at the White House Landing, where the advancing Union Army's main supply base was organized along the Pamunkey River outside of Richmond. One of her first actions proved what she was all about, proved her mettle. Quote, I saw the transport Wilson Small, it's the name of the ship, in the offing and knew it was full of wounded men. So, calling a boatman and directing him to row me to the vessel, I went on board. A poor fellow was undergoing an amputation, and seeing that the surgeon wanted help, I took hold of the limb and held it for him. That's her first action. The surgeon looked up, at first surprised, then said, thank you, and stayed behind and helped him. That was Helen. That's what she was made of. Towards the end of June 1862, Helen and others were forced to abandon the White House Landing after General Robert E. Lee's Confederates seized the offensive against his plotting nemesis, Major General George B. McClellan. Helen found safe passage on a vessel downriver to the safety of Fortress Monroe, then promptly caught a tugboat up the James River to a new forward supply base at a place called Harrison's Landing. Helen arrived at Harrison's Landing on July 3rd, 1862, and found the Union Army in full retreat at the very end of the series of battles known as the 7 Days. Quote, our small tugboat on which we were packed came alongside the Monitor. You all know the Monitor, the iron giant metal monster, was anchored at Harrison's Landing. We were almost surrounded by gunboats, and the firing was kept up all about us. We could see the bursting shells and hear the explosions, end quote. It's Helen's recollection. This was the first of many times that Helen came under hostile fire during the war. The next day, July 4th, Independence Day, was all chaos as Union forces made a hasty withdrawal from the shores of the James River in the face of the advancing enemy. Quote, the shore was alive with troops, and steamers were constantly arriving for the transport of sick and wounded who were lying on the ground, to be counted by acres, end quote. That's what Helen had to say. Trainloads of the ill, sick, and injured kept on coming. Helen shared her observations, quote, it was a touching sight to see these brave youth of our country, reduced by disease, come tottering towards us, entreating with imploring tones for a piece of bread or a cup of cold water. Everybody was in a whirl of activity, and the rush, heat, and confusion on shore one can never forget, as these overloaded trains arrived with their suffering freights of the wounded, who were fairly thrust upon these waiting boats, end quote. Helen volunteered with others to accompany 500 wounded men on a hospital steamer named the Knickerbocker. Just so happens that on board the Knickerbocker was Mayor Fay. He was returning from Chelsea. The two made the overnight trip to Washington together with the 500 passengers and other caregivers, where the patients were removed from the transport and sent to area hospitals in D.C. for further treatment. Reflecting on the massive withdrawal after the battles of the 7 Days, the editor of Mayor Fay's wartime papers declared, quote, it was into such a holocaust of suffering and death as this that Mr. Fay and Miss Gilson began their hospital work, end quote. The dynamic duo's highly effective partnership spanned the next 3 years as they traveled to battlefields in service of the sick and wounded, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Cold Harbor, the Wilderness, and elsewhere. They functioned as something of an independent relief agency in cooperation and coordination with the much larger U.S. Sanitary Commission, who supplied Mayor Fay and Helen with supplies when Mayor Fay ran low on shipments from Chelsea. People of Chelsea kept on sending supplies throughout the war. That the Sanitary Commission allowed Mayor Fay and Helen to operate is kind of remarkable, for the organizers of the Sanitary Commission believed in a single unified system for soldier care. But they realized that Mayor Fay and Helen performed a critical function that the commission could not. One way of explaining it was shared by Horace H. Furness, who was a fundraiser with the Sanitary Commission. Furness explained, quote, neither the Sanitary Commission nor the medical department, admirable as they both are, can alleviate all the misery caused by the war. In reality, about 1/8 of the sum total remains unalleviated, end quote. By supporting Mayor Frank and Helen, this is what Furness argued, quote, we are helping to diminish that eighth, and in such a way as not to conflict with the method and discipline of the medical department or with the grand federal principle of the Sanitary Commission, end quote. In short, Mayor Fay and Helen filled a void. They were able to reach that 1/8 of the sick and wounded soldiers that these major organizations could not get to. Mayor Fay's experience tending to wounded and dying soldiers on the furthest reaches of battlefields led him in early 1864 to suggest an idea. It was the systematic personal relief service, an auxiliary of the Sanitary Commission. In May of that year, 1864, the commission agreed and created the Auxiliary Relief Corps to serve those 1/8 of men and also other men who were in hospitals that needed further care. This move by the Sanitary Commission expanded its original mission to support men in camp and on campaign. This Auxiliary Relief Corps needed a director, and guess who got the job? Mayor Fay. He's the first director of this corps. And while he was director, he also continued to work with Helen because there were still men to save and men to support, caregiving to be had. Mayor Fay and Helen continued their work into 1865 when the war finally ended and they returned home to peace. Helen barely outlived the war. She married in 1866 and died just 2 years later in 1868. Her death was attributed to a pregnancy compromised by weakened health due to the rigors of her Army fieldwork as a nurse. Mayor Fay went on to become prominent in Veterans Affairs and social causes, including prison reform, the abolition of capital punishment, and prevention of cruelty to animals. He served in both houses of the Massachusetts legislature. Upon his death in 1904, at age 83, he was remembered by Chelsea citizens as the War Mayor. Mayor Fay's finest tribute may actually have come from a man named William Howell Reed. He's the author of a book called Hospital Life in the Army of the Potomac. Reed dedicated the volume to the Honorable Frank Fay, the humane and Christian gentleman, the friend of the soldier in camp and in hospital, and of the suffering everywhere, end quote. Author Reed added, quote, before he entered the Sanitary Commission, Mayor Fay was known in every division and brigade of the Army of the Potomac, and soldiers representing every state and probably nearly every county of the loyal North have at some time been the recipients of his kindly ministry or his generous aid. With characteristic foresight, he was always prepared and was early upon the field of battle with his stores replenished for the emergency, and with all these blessings, appliances of healing, moved among the dead and wounded, soothing helpless, suffering, and bleeding men, parched with fever, crazed with thirst, or lying neglected in the last agonies of death. And this service was performed with such humility and tenderness of spirit as is rarely combined with the self-contained force of a mature and disciplined mind. So there you have the story of truly a dynamic duo of caregiving during the Civil War, Mayor Frank Fay and Helen Gilson. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.